Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. So the ASA conference is coming up this year. It's going to be mid-year. It's going to be in New Zealand. So when you're hearing this episode, you have got probably about 6 months, a little bit less, to get yourself organised to come to the ASA conference in New Zealand. So think about joining us for the Australasian Animal Studies Association conference. It's called Decolonising Animals. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. I'll be there and I hope to see you there too. So that's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Okay, well, let's get down to business. It is a beautiful sunny day today here in New York City, and I'm really very thrilled to be at New York University and to be joined by Jeff Sebo. Jeff is Clinical Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of the Animal Studies MA program at New York University. And today we're going to discuss his new book, Chimpanzee Rights, which has just been published by Routledge, or perhaps been out a couple of months by the time you hear this. Now, he has a long list of co-authors, and, you know, it's quite intriguing the number of people who've worked collaboratively on this book. So I'm going to absolutely ask Jeff all about that. But I want to be sure to give a shout out to his co-authors. So I'm just going to run through their names. Kristin Andrews, Gary Comstock, J.K.D. Crozier, Sue Donaldson, Andrew Fenton, Tyler John.
Yep.
Oh, I've got that. So I had that backwards, obviously.
Oh, no problem.
Sid M. Johnson, Robert C. Jones, Will Kymlicks, Letitia Meynell, Nathan Nobis, and David Peña-Guzmán.
Exactly.
Okay. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Okay, Jeff, what's this book about? Why did you write this?
Well, this book has a pretty interesting origin story, which is that it originated as an amicus brief, which is basically a legal document that we wrote in collaboration with the Nonhuman Rights Project. The Nonhuman Rights Project is a U.S.-based organization that advocates for legal personhood for non-human animals, especially animals like chimpanzees or elephants. And they have been doing petitions on behalf of various animals, including 2 chimpanzees in New York, Keiko and Tommy. And their petitions so far had been unsuccessful, and so they were appealing to the New York court about the New York Court of Appeals. And this time they got philosophers and lawyers and primatologists and other experts to write amicus briefs, which are basically supporting documents by experts in different fields that bolster their case. So they gathered together 17 philosophers, including the authors of this book, to write an amicus brief, a philosophical brief, outlining why the various reasons that previous courts have used in order to deny non-human animals legal personhood are all bad. So we basically wrote a philosophical argument about why the theories of personhood that the previous courts had used were either bad theories of personhood or were good theories of personhood that, if plausibly interpreted, actually support some types of non-human personhood rather than not supporting non-human personhood. So we wrote this amicus brief and we submitted it to the New York Court of Appeals with the rest of the case in spring of 2018. And then, not too surprisingly, the Court of Appeals decided not to let the case go forward, which is not surprising because they only let about 5% of cases go forward. So it's quite unusual for them to let any case go forward. But the really interesting thing was that one of the judges on the New York Court of Appeals, Judge Fahey, wrote a long opinion that he released with that decision that was very supportive of the reasoning in the appeal. So Judge Fahey basically agreed with the Non-Human Rights Project and with the philosophers and lawyers and primatologists that the reasoning that the prior courts had used was bad reasoning, that this is an injustice that needs to be addressed, and that we will not have a fully just society until courts seriously reckon with the fact that non-human animals are currently treated as objects or property rather than as persons or any kind of rights holder under the law. So that was, at the very least, a symbolic victory that we hope will legitimize the issue and make it harder for other courts to dismiss, because now a judge on the top court in New York has said that this is a serious injustice that needs attention. So the Non-Human Rights Project is still working for chimpanzees and still working for Keiko and Tommy and moving on to other cases as well. But hopefully this will set at least an ideological or social precedent that will make it easier to do this kind of thing in the future. So in the wake of that, the authors of the amicus brief, or a subset of the authors of the amicus brief, decided to expand the amicus brief into a book and included a foreword by Laurie Gruen that provided social context and an afterword by Stephen Wise, the president of the Non-Human Rights Project, that provided legal context.
Fabulous. Well, Jeff, can you start by telling us who Keiko and Tommy are and a little bit about their lives?
Keiko and Tommy are two chimpanzees who allegedly live in New York, and they both have a history of being used by humans, I believe in the entertainment world, and harmed by humans, it seems. And now both of them are being held in captivity by private owners and are basically not living the types of lives that chimpanzees should be able to lead. So both of them are highly intelligent, highly social, highly sensitive animals who crave socialization, especially with other chimpanzees, but are living basically in isolation in small spaces without access to any of the things that would allow for a worthwhile life for a chimpanzee. And so the Non-Human Rights Project had been attempting to secure habeas corpus relief for them so that they could be removed from these facilities and placed into sanctuaries where they would have access to the kinds of social opportunities and other opportunities that would make for a good life for a chimpanzee.
So, Jeff, why these two individuals?
Well, that would be a better question for the Non-Human Rights Project. But I think in general, part of the idea behind the Non-Human Rights Project is that we tend to think of animals, and especially wild animals, as anonymous populations rather than as individuals with individual personalities and histories and lives. And so there might be specific reasons for picking Keiko and Tommy as opposed to other chimpanzees, and I imagine Steve Wise or Kevin Schneider could tell you what those reasons are. But in general, I think it matters that you select individual chimpanzees or elephants or dolphins with names and with histories and with stories and with relationships so that you can show judges and the society in general that these really are individuals and not just interchangeable, fungible members of a particular species. And a big part of what we need in order to secure the right kind of legal and political recognition for animals is to start seeing them more in the way that we see ourselves as individuals with individual rights, where those rights need to be protected, rather than just yet another chimpanzee who can be exchanged with other chimpanzees without loss.
So the issue, both the court case and also the book, had a lot to do with the notion of personhood. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what personhood is?
Yeah, this is a very confusing notion for a variety of reasons. One reason is that colloquially we tend to use the words human and person interchangeably, and that leads a lot of people to expect that human and person are synonyms, that they mean the same thing, which is not quite true. Human is best understood as a biological concept that at present refers to members of a particular species, Homo sapiens, And person is best understood as a moral and legal concept that refers to individuals who can hold moral and legal rights. The other thing that makes it confusing is that people often use the term person to refer to individuals who have a high degree of cognitive sophistication, who can use language and reason in particular impressive ways. But what is crucial to recognize is that at least in the U.S. legal context, and in many other legal contexts too, that is not what the word person is supposed to mean. All you need in order to be a person in a legal context is to be a rights holder, is to have the capacity to hold any rights at all. So under U.S. law, for example, all humans are persons, whether or not they have the types of cognitive capacities that would allow them to vote in an election or run for public office. They are nevertheless persons because they have the capacity to hold rights. And so when we talk about non-human personhood in general, or chimpanzee personhood in particular, that is the sense of personhood we're talking about, not a synonym for human, and not somebody who can drive or vote or hold public office, but rather someone who has the capacity to have rights. Because right now under the law, you can only be one of two things. You can be a person or you can be a thing. And to be a person is to have the capacity to have rights. To be a thing is to lack the capacity to have rights. Now, we might think that we should have further categories than that, but if we are insisting on having only those two categories, you can either be a person or be a thing, then our argument is that chimpanzees need to be understood as persons rather than as things.
It's really interesting what you say there, Jeff. It's, in a sense, it is... I mean, I've read your book and I've read other associated work, and I find it very persuasive. But it would be a big change, wouldn't it, if the court were to accept this?
It would be a huge change, yeah. If we allowed that non-humans are persons, that any non-humans are persons, then they would be rights holders. And if we took that seriously, then a lot of our practices and traditions would have to fundamentally change. A lot of our uses of animals that depend on them being treated as objects or property would have to be either abolished or so severely regulated and reformed that they would basically be abolished. And so I think a big part, honestly, of why courts have been so reluctant to take this issue seriously, and why some judges have offered such transparently bad arguments in favor of restricting personhood to humans, is that they see possible implications of recognizing the possibility of non-human personhood. They see that if they recognize the possibility of non-human personhood, it does raise quite fundamental and systematic questions about our treatment of animals on which our current social, political, and economic systems depend. And in order to stave off those questions, in order to prevent us from having to take seriously those questions, they construct bad arguments in favor of restricting personhood to humans.
Yeah, so you categorize those arguments against the attribution of personhood to non-human animals. I think you've got 4 categories. Mm-hmm. Can you run us through at least some of the arguments that are given in response to this suggestion?
So when judges, lawyers, philosophers suggest that we might consider treating non-humans as persons, usually the people who push back are presupposing some combination of 4 conceptions of personhood. The first is a species conception. This is basically the idea that in order to be a person, you must be a human. The second is a social contract conception, according to which in order to be a person, you must be a party to a social contract. You must in some sense be participating in a collective process of creating a society or creating a political community. The third is the community conception, which is that in order to be a person, you must in some sense be a member of a community, or you must be given personhood by other members of a community. And then the final is the capacities conception, which is that in order to be a person, you must have certain types of capacities, for example, sentience or communication or intelligence or autonomy. And so courts in the course of denying that non-human animals can be persons, have basically vacillated back and forth among these and presupposed different ones at different points in their arguments in often a sort of inconsistent or incoherent way. Or sometimes they pick one of them and argue that on the basis of that one, non-human animals can't be persons. Our approach in our amicus brief and in the book is to make two types of points. The first point is that the species membership conception of personhood fails. Species are morally arbitrary taxonomic categories, and there is no justification at all for using membership in any social or biological category, including species, as the basis for why you would hold moral and legal rights. Species, like any other social or biological category, really do not track what we would take to be independently morally significant properties in any kind of reliable way. There is a lot of variation within species, a lot of similarity across species, and species can change over time. So as with everything else, we think that is a non-starter as a serious contender for a legally or philosophically satisfactory conception of personhood. So that one fails. The other three, social contract, community membership, and capacities, we think if those are charitably and plausibly interpreted as we would interpret them in the case of humans, then they actually support the idea of non-human personhood rather than denying the idea of non-human personhood. In all three cases, if we were to accept that in the case of humans, we would interpret it in such a way that allows for all humans, independently of whether they participate in contracts, independently of exactly what kind of role they have within the community as long as they are part of the community, and independently of exactly how rational or autonomous they are as long as they have a basic sensitivity, basic emotionality, any kind of social relationships with others. We take that as sufficient for them to be persons with rights. And so if we want to consistently and plausibly interpret those conceptions, we need to extend personhood to chimpanzees like Keiko and Tommy.
Do you get the sense that it is becoming increasingly difficult to develop coherent or respectable arguments in opposition to the notion that personhood might be extended beyond the human boundary?
Can you repeat the question?
Do you feel that among the people who want to reject the notion that non-human animals might hold personhood, it's becoming increasingly difficult to formulate persuasive arguments? Is it becoming less credible?
I do think that what has happened this year has been important for legitimizing the idea that non-human animals should be persons. The arguments for them not being persons are bad, but have always been assumed without argument. And what is starting to happen now, in part thanks to the work of lots of activists and advocates and organizations like the Non-Human Rights Project, is that people are starting to have to actually contend with these arguments and justify, or at least rationalize, the idea that animals should be denied personhood. And once you actually start talking about these issues on the merits, it will be a lot harder to justify calling them objects or property. And actually a lot of legal jurisdictions are now starting to either call non-human animals persons or more commonly create third categories like sentient beings. So for example, just within the past week or so, Mexico City enacted a new constitution that calls animals sentient beings and says that we have a moral obligation to protect them. And more jurisdictions are starting to do this now. And the more that happens and the more that judges start to take it seriously, there will be social pressure to actually consider the arguments rather than dismiss them out of hand.
Wonderful. Well, before we move on to our quick questions, I must ask, what was it like working with so many philosophers?
It was honestly a really incredible experience, and I'm shocked it went as smoothly as it did, because philosophers, like members of any profession, don't agree with each other about much, if anything at all. And that was certainly true of the 17 people who worked on the amicus brief and then the 13 people who worked on the book. We disagree about all sorts of things. Some of us are utilitarians, others are rights theorists, others are relational theorists. We have different views of personhood, whether there should even be a notion of personhood. And so we disagree about all sorts of issues. And obviously those disagreements came up in the course of writing the book, and we had quite heated conversations sometimes about how we should approach a certain issue, how we should discuss or argue for certain points, whether we should discuss or argue for certain points. But the amazing thing is that we worked together remarkably well throughout that process, and we resolved all of the disagreements amicably. All of us are good friends. No relationships were destroyed in the course of writing this book. And I think I take a few things away from that. One is that I do think that everybody was focused on writing the best possible argument to support Keiko and Tommy and other non-human animals, and that shared aspiration trumped whatever local disagreements we might have had. The second is, I think we all agreed that our working together, in spite of certain types of disagreements, made the work stronger overall, because we were able to improve all of the arguments that ended up in the book. And that was a wonderful thing to be able to do. And the final thing is, even though we disagreed about particular issues, we all agreed about the fundamental thesis that we were arguing for, that if we are going to insist on classifying everyone as either a person or a thing, then we must, rationally and morally must, classify non-human animals like Keiko and Tommy as persons rather than as things. And then, moreover, we all agreed that the reason we should do that is that the species membership argument fails, and the other three conceptions of personhood, understood correctly, entail that non-human animals like Keiko and Tommy should be persons. And so we were able to focus our arguments on those points, construct the best possible arguments for those points, and then compromise on or resist the temptation to discuss other issues that we disagreed about. And I'll say one more brief thing about this, which is I think that this amicus brief in this book is the type of thing I would like to see more of, and that I'd like to participate in more, because I think it was a really good example of collaborative and practically engaged philosophy. And I know that some disciplines do a lot of collaborative work. Philosophers tend to be socialized so that we work more solo and theoretical. And I think this was a really good exception to that, and it was a valuable experience for a lot of us to have, and I would love to see more philosophers doing this kind of work.
Wonderful. Well, I tip my hat to you and all your fellow co-authors, or all your co-authors, I should say. Well, Jeff, I ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals to answer some quick questions. Because you're a return guest, you've got 4 quick questions. Are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
Absolutely.
What's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of working in the field of animal studies?
Oh, I think there are so many satisfying and rewarding aspects of working in this field. One is, of course, that I can work in a field that is so deeply connected to what I care about in the world. And so I can bring together my professional life with the rest of my life in a way that I love to be able to do. Another is that animal studies is radically interdisciplinary. So it spans the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences. And so you can study things, learn things, teach things, write about things at the intersection of many of those fields, which is something that I really enjoy doing as someone who likes doing work that might be a little bit broader rather than a little bit more hyper-specialized within one particular discipline or subdiscipline. And then another thing is that we have this rare and special and wonderful opportunity to work at a field which is in a pretty formative stage in its development. So obviously animal studies has existed for a long time in literature and in classes, but institutionally, there are only now starting to be programs and centers in animal studies, and everybody is sorting out what this field means and how we should go about teaching it and producing scholarship in it. And to be able to work in a field at that formative time where the work that people are doing could actually fairly significantly affect the trajectory of what I take to be an important field is an incredible opportunity that I feel really grateful to have.
Wonderful. Well, what's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of conducting animal studies research?
Well, I think the most challenging aspect is connected to what makes it exciting, which is how formative it is. So one issue is, of course, that not many people know what animal studies is, or many people might misunderstand what animal studies is. So if you tell people that you work in animal studies, you might either get puzzled looks, or people might assume that you do laboratory research on non-human subjects, which is, of course, not really at the center of what a lot of people in animal studies are doing. So there is a lot of not quite resistance, but confusion, puzzlement, or misunderstanding or miscommunication that you need to gracefully navigate. And that is connected to the fact that there currently is not as strong an institutional infrastructure for animal studies as there is for many other academic disciplines. So there might be less funding available for animal studies. There might be fewer universities that have undergraduate or graduate programs, or who are doing faculty hiring in animal studies. And those are obstacles to building the field. But part of what makes it exciting is that we can participate in an effort to build it up in those ways, to create an international community of animal studies scholars, or identify an international community of animal studies scholars, and then to support them all in creating animal studies programs in their universities and so on. So I think the strengths and limitations and what makes it exciting and challenging are all pretty deeply interconnected.
Wonderful. Well, Jeff, now's your opportunity to give a shout out to a scholar who you think listeners should be made aware of. It could be an emerging scholar. It could be someone who is not receiving the level of kind of recognition you feel they should. It could be perhaps someone who's writing in a language other than English. It could be in an adjacent field.
Okay, great. There are obviously so many people to mention. I'll restrict myself to, I guess, 3, but obviously
very disciplined.
Yeah, obviously there are a ton of really exciting younger people working in this field, and I can't wait to see what all of them do. But the 3 people I'll mention, one I have to mention as the most junior co-author of the Chimpanzee Rights book is Tyler John, who is an incredibly impressive philosophy PhD student at Rutgers University, who is working on questions connected with the ethics of activism and advocacy, and also the political standing of non-human animals, and how political theory and political philosophy connects with animal ethics. And I think his work is interesting, and people will be really interested in following it. Another is my colleague Nandini Thiagarajan at NYU. She is a postdoctoral fellow right now at NYU, and she does work in literary studies and post-colonial studies, and thinks about how animality is connected with storytelling, I think, in really, really incredible and interesting ways. And I think people will be really interested in following her work too. And then the third is quite different, but because of the timing of this interview, I feel like I need to mention her. Mary Midgley is a powerhouse, a giant in animal ethics, but is, relatively speaking, in comparison with people like Peter Singer and Tom Regan, neglected. So Mary Midgley is, or was, I should now say, an animal ethicist who published more than a dozen books, many of them connected with animal ethics, much of which has been incredibly important and influential. Her book, Animals and Why They Matter, for me, has been a really, really significant and really influential book, and I assign the first chapter from that book as the first reading of my ethics and animals class every semester. Now, she passed away at the age of 99 within the past week, and so I think now is a really good time to reflect on her role in the development of animal ethics and animal studies, and a good occasion for everybody to go back and revisit her work, and to remember why her work really does merit being up there along with Singer and Regan, because there have been points, maybe because of reasons connected with gender, or maybe because her work is a little bit more difficult to classify in terms of a particular moral theory. Whatever the reason, her work has never received the level of recognition that others have received. And so I think now would be a good time for us to all go back and remember that we should be incorporating it in our teaching and our scholarship.
Fantastic. And Valet, it was very, very sad news.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff, are you optimistic about the future of human, non-human animal relations?
I'm not optimistic about anything. So against the baseline of everything else in the world, I am sure relatively optimistic about the future of human-non-human relations. But at this particular social and political moment, I think it would be naive to be optimistic about pretty much anything. However, I think we all ought to work really hard to make it as likely as possible that humans and non-humans will have some kind of decent future, which is why we are doing what we're doing here.
Wonderful. Well, Jeff, what are you working on next?
My next book is on animals and climate change, and that will be about animal agriculture as a cause of climate change and how we need to resist animal agriculture in order to mitigate human-caused climate change, and also about wild animals as victims of climate change and how we need to consider the interests of wild animals as we adapt to climate change. And so that'll be what I work on primarily in terms of scholarship over the next couple of years, in addition to some other odds and ends in supporting the two books that just came out. And then the other main thing is developing the Animal Studies MA program at NYU and the new Research Center for Environmental and Animal Protection at NYU, both of which launched about a month ago. And so we're in the early stages of building both of those up. So I'll be excited to work on those things.
Yes, and a very big congratulations on those achievements.
Thank you very much.
So, Jeff, how can people find out more about your work?
You can Google me, or you can Google the NYU Animal Studies program. My name is Jeff Sebo, Sebo, and the NYU Animal Studies program is easy enough to find, and you can find information about me and about us at either of those places.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thank you for having me.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget that you can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. We also have a Facebook page and an Instagram account. Finally, don't forget to leave a review with iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.